Hi, welcome to the bathtub. This is the old master bather, and I haven't changed my shirt since the last talk 15 minutes ago, and I'm still nursing the same Manhattan and the floral, the Raymond Chandler Memorial floral pattern glass martini glass, because that's exactly the one that Philip Marlowe used to drink out of. If you know anything about Philip Marlowe, he drank out of glasses just like this. And I've talked about my personal relationship with AVRAM Davidson, a very close friend who I love was a very important person to me as a friend and just a person I loved. That's all I can say, and who's also a very good writer, who I didn't probably many of whose stories I've loved immediately when I read them, and much of whose work I always I had trouble with often. I've never been able. He's a very original, unusual writer. And I think that the topic, the theme show I'm tagging this with today is a pretty good comparison, which is if you like R.A. Lafferty, you will like AVRAM Davidson. Now, they are totally different writers, completely different writers. The only reason they kind of fit together in some people's heads, and certainly in my head, is they were both extraordinary composites of information. They both read just voraciously and remembered everything they read, and remembered incredible details and had fun with those details. AVRAM could make jokes about, I said the last time, the Habsburg Empire. He could make jokes about, the peculiar spaying pigs. He would learn about how pigs were spayed. I think he actually did a degree in shepherding at one point in his life. The information he had at his disposal was not pretentious. He really was interested in it. I mean, one of the things I kind of stumbled on talking about before was his interest in everything from transmutation of gold. He would study old books about alchemy when he wrote the Virgil Magus books, and he would remember all these details. And he loved all that stuff. He loved just information, and whether it was history, particularly history and ancient history, and he loved knowledge. It was a very he loved books, old AVRAM, and so his work is the words that come to my mind are lapidary. They're ornate, like Lafferty. The style is actually even more complex than Lafferty's. Lafferty's sentences are not as hard to parse as some of AVRAM's sentences, which are kind of hard to actually find your way from the beginning to the end. But when you do find your way and you reread those sentences, they have great energy. They have the rhythms they want you to read them in, and you have to read carefully and often reread them. I've often found that when I read his stuff the first time, I sometimes just get puzzled. So I want to take a few things about just his general work, recommend different things you might like, and then talk about some of his more difficult work. Here's some of his early books, his short stories. AVRAM was best known as a short story writer, and he wrote some great classic short stories. Or All the Seas with Oysters was one of his most famous stories about an alien invasion of gestating aliens. They start off as paper clips, then they turn into coat hangers, and they turn into bicycles. It's a very funny, charming, strange story. It was one of his Hugo Award. He won a Hugo Award for that story. All the stories in these were very funny, very strange, unusual, comic. He's a funny writer. I remember this one, What Strange Stars and Skies. I read this when I was 14 or 15, probably just about the time before I met AVRAM, or about that time. It has some wonderful stories, some very challenging, complex stories I didn't understand at all. One of my favorite ghost stories is in here called Fade Out, F-A-E-D, Fade Out. It's a ghost you can't spell, or has something, I can't remember the story, but I remember thinking it was one of the best ghost stories I ever read. And these were all books he wrote when he was alive. He was known for starting series, particularly trilogies. I've never read this one. I never got through this one, but I'm going to try it again soon. The Island Under the Earth. This was the first volume of a trilogy, a perspective trilogy, which AVRAM didn't finish. He started another one called Peregrine Primus, Peregrine Secundus, and then he never got to the third one. His most famous series was this, The Phoenix and the Mirror. Beautiful old book. Look at that beautiful old book. I mentioned this in the last episode. When I was a kid, I read this. It has some incredibly beautiful prose and unusual prose passages. And I had no idea what was happening half the time. and I need to really go back and reread this. He was also an extraordinary editor. I think I want to go back and actually just read the 3 volumes he edited of the best from fantasy and science fiction, because just looking at this one volume, there were so many Thomas Dishes, some early Tom Dish, Ron Goulart, one of the great comic writers. I mentioned this in the last one, Automatic Tiger by Kit Reed, one of the stories that's always been in my mind since I read it as a kid. And he was editor of the magazine of fantasy and science fiction for 3 years, and I think his tenure was really a significant one. And I would like to go back and reread most of those old issues. Now, after he died in 1993, his wife, or his ex-wife, Grania Davis, who also knew briefly, edited a number of books. A number of books came out. This is called the AVRAM Davidson Treasury. I haven't actually read it since it came out. It's filled with introductions by everyone from Guy Davenport and Gene Wolfe to Gregory Benford, Tom Dish, all the people who loved Tom Avram's work, who were just numerous. There were many people. The people who knew Avram's work loved his work, and many of them, like Tom Dish, loved him as editors. He was close friends of Harlan Ellison. They were very close. A number of other books have come out, and again, I'm trying to remember. There's Richard Lupoff. I don't know why I couldn't remember his name earlier. Richard Lupoff edited another volume. I can't remember where that is. Oh, I know it is. It's a book of mystery stories. Harlan Avram was also published a lot of stories in the mystery magazines, and I don't know those as well. I have to say, I read a couple, and I want to go back and read them. There's this one edited by Grania Davis and Henry Wessels, who I just actually had a little brief correspondence with, who was a big, devoted fan of Avram's. Didn't know him personally, and has started a website for him, and has been, kind of keeping the flame alive wherever he could. And this looks like an interesting collection of his work too. So there's lots of collections of his stories. Here's another one. I wanted to mention this in the last one. This is called the Redwood Edward Papers, which I've had since probably it came out when I was a kid. And it's edited by a man who showed up in my house because he was taking a class from my wife, Michael Kurland, a very good comic writer himself, and he was a friend of Avram's, and I think we had met a few times briefly. So anyway, just a small world around. Avram had a lot of friends, a lot of devoted friends, and a lot of wonderful writers were influenced by him, like Richard Lupoff and Michael Kurland. Robert Silverberg was one of the editors of that previous volume. I'm just saying this to say how many good writers knew who Avram was and found him so interesting. Now, I wanted to talk briefly, because the book I went back to reread because of the connection with the Harlan Ellison story was the Enquiries of Doctor Eszterhazy. And I knew Avram when he was writing this. This is when we were neighbors in Richmond District. Avram would sometimes show me some of his manuscript pages, which were indecipherable. I mean, they looked like Sanskrit. They were typed with and on carbons, and he would retype in sections all over the place. I mean, they were just like palimpsests of all these different ideas. But he said he wrote first draft. He never wrote second drafts, but he would obviously go through and amend and rewrite and add stuff. And I knew him when he was writing this, and I have to say, he would show me a couple of them, and I couldn't make head nor tail of them. I didn't understand them when they were coming out. And when the book came out, I did enjoy some of the stories a lot, such as the first story, Polly Charms, the Sleeping Woman. We talked a bit about this earlier. But I also would get baffled sometimes and have trouble reading the stories because there's so much happening in an Avram Davidson story. And there's a lot happening in this one. When I was rereading them, and I was just totally charmed by these stories when I reread them the past few days. I read the first 3 stories in basically one afternoon. They take a lot of concentration. I want to show you why. And then when you do give them that, when you give them the concentration and the attention they deserve, they really make you laugh. They're unusual. They're incomparable stories. And the Enquiries of Doctor Eszterhazy is set in a mythical state somewhere in the middle of Yugoslavia, or somewhere in the middle of this. It's like an imaginary country of all these different nations that, like Yugoslavia, were kind of joined together and sewn together from all these different states and all these old antiquated political systems, and they're all stitched together with all these ridiculously outrageous rituals and ritualistic behavior and history, and Avram basically invents it all. It's 6 or 8 stories, about 200 pages, and it reminds me, when I was reading it now, it reminded me a lot of Thomas Pynchon. It's a weird comparison, but they really remind me of each other. That interest in esoteric information and the creation of kind of secret worlds and secret societies. I don't think they ever read much of each other, but they should have. I'm sure they would enjoy one another. Anyway, I read the first 3 stories, and Polly Charms, a Sleeping Woman, is about, it's kind of a Dr. Caligari story about Esterhazy, who has a PhD, I can't remember, in law and medicine and literature, and then he has another one, I forget, history or something, and then he has 3 or 4 honorary degrees. At one point, he says, I've got all these PhDs. He tells some guy, you should call me doctor. And the guy says, well, I should call you doctor. And Esterhazy says, yes, that's probably true. He's a very erudite man who he doesn't really solve crime so much as investigates things. And the plot development of an Avram Davidson story is really, really hard to explain. It tends to be a series of events and set pieces and comic set pieces that are just impacted with sort of history and backstory and histories of little secret societies and so forth. And then these scenes kind of gather momentum until at the end you kind of realize how they're all connected together, and they are connected together. This opening story is about a woman who's been asleep for, we don't know, 30 years, 40 years, and she has hair. She sleeps in this kind of coffin type thing, and her hair is all over the place. And there's some old kind of grubby showman who takes her out, like Dr. Caligari's creature, and says to people, well, ask her questions, and she'll answer her questions. You can't really compare Avram's stories, and this particularly good book, which you really need to get in this edition. There's a later edition in which Avram wrote a number of additional stories, which I've been told don't quite fit with them, so I don't know. I would say this book by itself is worth having. I want to give you one quick example. So I read the first 3 stories. I couldn't put it down. And then I read the 4th story called The Church of Saint Satan and Pandemons. Now, there's every other word you have to stop and think about how to pronounce it in Avram's work. I read this story. There was parts of it that made me laugh. And when I was finished with it, I had no idea what happened. And I went back and read it again, and it's a wonderful story. So that's kind of my experience of reading Avram. You really need to almost reread it all, and then hear the rhythms, and hear the comedy, and hear the complexity of what happens in a single paragraph in Avram Davidson's work. It's not the sort of stuff, again, you sell this at a drugstore, which is where these books were sold to science fiction fans, and they're going to go, what the hell is this? It's not, these books they never became bestsellers, but they should be classics if there's any justice in life. So I wanted to just read one paragraph, because there's just so many things in this. All right, I'm just going to pick this one. There's a lot of passages like this. 103, again, he's invented these old countries that are all stitched together. He reminds me a little bit of Nabokov, too, those fantastic nations that Nabokov would create. And he talks about, one of the stories, by the way, I wanted to mention this. In the second story, Esterhazy solves a crime of the theft of some jewels through phrenology, the studying of bumps on someone's head. And he's made a map of the bumps on the criminal's head, so he knows all about the criminal. It's that kind of tongue-in-cheek playing with kind of esoteric or ersatz knowledge, in the same way that alchemy becomes kind of a text for some of the Virgil stories, that makes him so complicated and charming. This is the opening of the paragraph, a typical paragraph. The marketplace in Poposhki, Georgiou, I don't know if that's pronounced right, smelled like a barn. That is, assuming a barn to have borne, in addition to the usual odors of hay and dung and animals, a strong scent of ripe fruit, cheap perfume, kerosene, hot grease, fried meat, and fresh-baked pastry. Now, the first part of the sentence, it smelled like a barn. Almost any of us could have written that sentence, and the reader would, okay, I know what you're talking about. But then Avram qualifies it, and he qualifies it again. And the list of things he qualifies it with, from kerosene, hot grease, and fresh-baked pastry, places you in this completely incomprehensible scene. A rather unlikely combination for a barn. And then he goes back to the idea of the barn. It must be admitted. So he's basically said, okay, I compare it to a barn, but it actually doesn't have anything to do with a barn. It's like something else. And here we are, in the marketplace of Poposhki, Georgia, Tuesday, since time immemorial, that is, for the past 17 or 18 years, has been Little Market Day. Great Market Day is Friday. Little Market Day is largely reserved for trading in mules, oxen, and he-goats. Only the men come to Little Market Day. Little Market Day really smells like a barn. That is, a barn in which someone has been spilling a great deal of beer and a great deal of the cheapest variety of distilled spirit, known in the local dialect as maiden's breath. Now, when you take your time and you read through these, he creates all of these new ideas, and the maiden's breath comes back as a joke in the next paragraph or two. You have to take your time in one of his stories. You have to be able to focus, particularly in the Esterhazy stories. But they're unlike any other stories I've ever read. I can't think of anybody, except almost some of those really early kind of weird passages in V, where Pynchon is talking about real history and fake history. But the prose reads much nicer. It has a much nicer sense of rhythm, and they're actually beautiful sentences and unusual sentences that can't really be compared to anyone. So today we wanted to compare them to, we're going to say, if you liked R.A. Lafferty, very different type of writer, but I think you should certainly try AVRAM Davidson. And I definitely will do another AVRAM book under sui generis because you can't compare him really to anybody. But I would really recommend him. Find this one if you can. Definitely pick up some of the short stories. And if you had to pick one book, probably this AVRAM David Treasury, which was put together by people who loved him and all the writers who loved him, then this might be the one place to start with his short stories. But I really come down hard on Esterhazy. I think I agree with Richard Lupoff. I think this is the best and the most rereadable of all of AVRAM's books. All right, we're going to do more of AVRAM. Thanks for sticking with me on this kind of this trip down kind of memory lane. Very complicated, very hard writer to describe, but definitely worth exploring for some people. Okay, happy bathing.